I'm joined this week by our editor-in-chief, Hugo Gurdon. And Hugo, on the cover of the magazine this week, we have a piece looking at China not necessarily being this monolithic entity that we sort of think of it as. How do you sort of explain that thesis, and what are the implications for the West?
Yeah, we wanted to, as it were, dispel the myth that China is this monolith. People, I think, tend to regard it, because it's so dangerous, because it's a rising hegemon and wants to challenge the United States for world leadership. There's a tendency to think of it as this enormous, unified, powerful country. It isn't unified at all, and that's the nature of tyrannies. General David Stilwell, who wrote the piece for us, has written that it's a tyranny, a core tyranny surrounded by buffers. Mm-hmm. There's the buffer of what he calls, well, there's Chinese-occupied Tibet. Mm-hmm. There's Chinese-occupied Inner Mongolia. There's all around it, it has these buffer zones which are ethnically different. It needs the buffer zones because it's a tyranny. It needs to separate the core Han people from outside influence. The problem that this creates is that China is surrounded, a problem for Beijing this is, that mm-hmm. it is the main core tyranny is surrounded by resentful people who don't feel themselves and indeed are not Chinese. Mm-hmm. And we tend to think, when we focus on China, we tend to think of how do we deal with Beijing and how are we going to deal with Taiwan if they're. But Stilwell's thesis is that the buffer zones are an inherent problem for China, and that that this actually offers us another way of tackling this growing power.
So this is an opportunity, as it were, for the West.
Yes, it absolutely is a chance and an opportunity for the West. I mean, one of the things that Stilwell makes clear is that the system doesn't really work because of these buffer zones. You know, China wants to have a sort of propaganda model where it tries to control these zones, control the minorities, and there's just a few brilliant examples in the article. One of which was that it was made Chinese law that the next Dalai Lama right. must be reincarnated within China. He mm-hmm. could not be reincarnated outside China, which is where, of course, the Dalai Lama himself is in India. Mm-hmm. And the absurdity of the government in Beijing thinking that it can dictate by passing a law where the next Dalai Lama will be reincarnated is a token of the absurdity of the propaganda machine that it runs. There's a few other ones that, for example, they chose the tune of America the Beautiful to play in the space station that they mm-hmm. have. They are so cut off from the realities of the world, and they want their people to be cut off from the realities of the world. That's why they have the buffer zones. But the buffer zones, to some extent, prevent the Chinese leadership from realizing how absurd and unpersuasive they are. So there is an opportunity for the West to undermine the sort of Chinese imperium, which is expanding, by agitating in these buffer zones and making Beijing have to focus on the outer regions.
I mean, we often talk about how China uses the openness of our society and the openness of our markets right. against us. Right. This may be an area where we could use the closeness yes. of their society against them.
Exactly so. I mean, when the Soviet Union existed, and the satellite communications sort of began, I remember reading a magazine cover which said all the world's a dish, which is the threat to tyrannies, and it meant the Soviet Union in this case, of being able to beam information into these places. China wants to be a closed society. It doesn't want its people to know the truth. Countries which subject their own governments to the will of the people, where the government can be swapped out if the people choose, are right. inherently stronger than the ones which have to hold their people down by force, especially at a time when communications are actually easier. So yes, it is the Chinese use our open system as do indeed all sorts of sort of leftist agitators, use the legal system of liberal democracy, etc., to undermine liberal democracy. But it's our opportunity to undermine the tyranny of this rising hegemon using its own closed system.
Thank you, Hugo. And if you're following us on YouTube, you can click here on our digital magazine to read the full cover story.